Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's jump in. It began on an ordinary morning when the world felt at peace. People were rushing to their routines. Commuters huddled in subway stations. Children grumbled about going to school, and the elderly sat in cafes chatting about the weather. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But then everything changed in an instant. The sky, once a clear blue canvas, tore open as if some unseen force had shredded it with a mighty claw. At first, no one knew what to think. It wasn't a storm, or a meteor shower, or any kind of natural disaster we were familiar with. It looked like a rip, a tear, and through it, something emerged. Huge, dark shapes poured out from the rift, moving with the kind of purpose that left no room for doubt. They weren't birds, or planes, or anything that could be explained. These were warships, massive and terrifying. The sky thrummed with the power of them, their engines humming in low, reverberating waves that made the air itself seem alive. People stared in confusion, unsure whether to run, to scream, or to just pretend it wasn't happening. But there was no denying it. It was happening. And then the first explosion ripped through the city. The sound was deafening. No warning, no sign. It was like the city had simply vanished, leaving only an eerie, suffocating silence behind. The news reports called it a disaster, but those who survived knew the truth. This wasn't some freak accident. It wasn't a meteor strike or an earthquake. It was an invasion. And it wasn't just one city that fell. It was New York, Paris, Tokyo. The invaders didn't negotiate, didn't talk. They didn't even acknowledge us. They simply erased everything in their path, wiping out whole cities in the blink of an eye. Humanity fought back, of course. Fighter jets were scrambled, nukes were launched. But every missile, every bomb, every soldier, nothing stopped them. The alien technology was so far beyond ours that we might as well have been throwing stones at them. One by one, the cities were gone, and fear began to spread like wildfire. The world was crumbling, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The panic set in. Desperation swept over every corner of the earth. But even in the face of certain destruction, one thing became clear. Humans didn't just give up. Not when it mattered. In the midst of the chaos, as cities burned and the death toll climbed, the world tried desperately to make sense of it all. Governments, once powerful and organized, found themselves floundering. Their military forces were helpless. The most advanced weapons at their disposal were useless against the alien warships, which moved with eerie precision and power. The global response was a mixture of confusion and fear. Every leader promised action, but nothing was happening. Nations scrambled to send out distress signals, but there was no answer. The invaders were silent. They didn't need to say a word. Their presence spoke volumes. They came, they attacked, and they didn't care about anything else. The sky was filled with ships, stretching across the heavens like a dark tide. It was like a nightmare, one that no one could wake up from. And the worst part was, no one knew why. Some began to question if it was really happening at all. Maybe it was a grand illusion, a test, or some twisted hoax. But the reports kept coming in, one after another. Cities were disappearing, buildings turned to dust, and millions of lives were being wiped out. There was no room for doubt anymore. Humanity was on the brink of extinction, and the invaders weren't interested in making a deal. They weren't here to talk. They were here to conquer, and they would do so with ruthless efficiency. In the heart of this unfolding nightmare, a small town in Montana became the last flicker of hope. It wasn't a place that would have stood out on most maps. It was a forgotten corner of the world, tucked away far from the reach of anything that mattered to global powers. No one would have ever thought that something so vital could be born in a town so unremarkable. But that's where Marcus Lane lived. Marcus Lane wasn't just a retired engineer. He was the kind of person who had spent his entire life in the shadows, working on projects that no one else wanted to touch. He wasn't just an inventor. He was a creator of weapons. And not just any weapons. These were creations so dangerous that the governments of the world had buried them. Some classified them as black ops projects, too dangerous to ever see the light of day. Others simply swept them under the rug, hoping they would never come to fruition. But Marcus had never stopped working. Even after he retired, his mind never stopped. And when the invasion began, Marcus knew exactly what he had to do. While the world burned, Marcus didn't panic. He didn't run or hide. Instead, he went to work. He went into the basement of his small home, where his collection of unfinished projects, discarded blueprints, and half-baked ideas were scattered in every corner. The town was quiet, its people unaware of the fate that was unfolding outside. But Marcus wasn't concerned with the town. He wasn't concerned with anything except the task at hand, building a weapon strong enough to stop the invaders. 3 days went by as Marcus worked non-stop. Sweat dripped from his brow as he welded, connected wires, and attached components to what appeared to be an oversized satellite dish mounted on the back of an old, rusted pickup truck. It was the kind of project that no one would have believed possible, and it looked nothing like what you'd expect from someone trying to save the world. In fact, if you saw it, you'd probably think Marcus was just some eccentric old man with too much time on his hands. But this wasn't some half-baked hobby. This was his last shot. The world was crumbling, and he was humanity's last chance. The sounds of explosions echoed in the distance. The skies were filled with the rumble of alien ships as they obliterated the last remnants of civilization. The world governments were still scrambling, still trying to get a grip on the situation. But none of their weapons worked. It was too late for conventional strategies. And so, Marcus continued working. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for help. He worked alone, just like he always had. He was a man with nothing left to lose, but everything to fight for. Then, on the 3rd day, it was done. The weapon was finished. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't sleek or modern. It looked like a piece of junk. An old satellite dish bolted onto a pickup truck that was missing half its paint. But in Marcus's eyes, it was a miracle. It was hope. He connected it to an old CB radio and, without any ceremony, turned it on. The truck's engine sputtered, but the machine hummed to life. He pointed it toward the nearest alien ship, its massive black frame hovering above the town. For a brief moment, Marcus felt a flicker of doubt. Could this really work? The ship was huge, menacing, and alien technology was so far beyond anything humanity had ever seen. What was one little homemade weapon going to do? But the doubts quickly disappeared as Marcus flipped a switch and pressed the button. The air seemed to crackle with energy. For a moment there was silence, as if the world itself had held its breath. Then a pulse of light shot out from the satellite dish. It wasn't just a flash. It wasn't just a beam. The entire sky seemed to crack under the pressure of the shot. The alien ship didn't explode, nor did it fall from the sky. It simply vanished. There was no debris, no smoke, no wreckage. One moment, the massive warship was there, looming above, and the next, it was gone, like it had never existed in the first place. Marcus stared at the empty sky, a mix of disbelief and awe washing over him. Had he really done it? Had he just destroyed an alien ship? He didn't have time to think about it. He grabbed the CB radio, connected it to the dish's control panel, and broadcasted the message straight into the invaders' communication network. His voice, rough and shaky but full of authority, went out across the stars. Earth to the invaders, attack again, and face total annihilation. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. And then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the alien ships stopped. They paused. A strange sense of confusion rippled through the invaders' ranks. They hesitated. The ships that had been attacking without mercy suddenly retreated. They didn't fire another shot. They didn't say a word. They simply turned and vanished, retreating back through the rift in the sky, leaving Earth in stunned silence. The world wasn't saved, not by a long shot. The damage was done, the death toll staggering. But for the first time since the invasion began, there was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Earth wasn't done yet. The invaders had tasted human defiance, and they hadn't liked it. But Marcus knew better than to believe this was the end. This was just the beginning. The aliens would be back. And next time, they would be prepared. In the days that followed, the world was left in a strange, almost surreal silence. The air still carried the scent of burning cities, and the sky, though now clear, felt ominous, as if it was watching, waiting. For once, humanity had the upper hand, and yet it was a fleeting victory, one born of pure chance and desperation. The invaders had retreated, but Marcus knew it wasn't over. The aliens hadn't been defeated. They had simply been caught off guard, stunned by the sudden attack. Fear had driven them away, but fear was a temporary thing. The problem was, no one knew how long it would take before they came back. And when they did, they would come back stronger, more prepared, and more determined to finish what they had started. The world, now in a state of shock, began to piece itself back together. The first few days were a blur of chaos. Survivors, exhausted and traumatized, wandered the streets, searching for loved ones, for shelter, for answers that no one could provide. News outlets tried to explain what had happened, but they were as clueless as everyone else. There was no explanation for the invaders' appearance, no sense of why they had attacked. Governments scrambled to regain control, and the military forces that had once been the world's strongest now seemed like paper tigers, incapable of defending against the otherworldly power that had descended upon them. But in the midst of the ruins, something remarkable was happening. People, once divided by borders, by ideologies, by ancient feuds, were beginning to come together. For the first time in human history, there was no more room for division. The threat was too great, too universal. It didn't matter where you were from, what language you spoke, or what flag you waved. The enemy was the same for all of them, and that meant that humanity had to unite, or face extinction. The world's leaders, those who had previously fought over resources and political power, put aside their differences. They had no choice. The aliens had shown no mercy, and humanity had to learn to fight together if they hoped to stand a chance. In Montana, life slowly returned to a fragile semblance of normalcy. The town, once a quiet, forgotten place, now became a symbol of resistance. People from neighboring towns, and even those from cities further away, began to make their way to the small rural community. They came seeking answers, hoping that Marcus Lane, the man who had somehow repelled the alien invaders, would have the key to humanity's survival. But Marcus wasn't interested in playing hero. He didn't want fame. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted to prepare. As soon as the aliens retreated, Marcus had gone back to work, tinkering with his weapon and building new designs. He knew that one shot had been a fluke. The alien forces were too advanced, too powerful, for anything humanity could throw at them with what little knowledge they had. His device, however miraculous, was based on old, forgotten military theories. He had cobbled it together in 3 days out of desperation, but there was no way to replicate it. No one knew how it worked, not even Marcus, and now the world needed to understand it, fast. But the moment the world's leaders set their eyes on Marcus and his weapon, things began to change. They saw in him not just a man, but a resource, a tool. They descended on his small town in droves. Military officials, politicians, scientists, all of them arrived with one thing in mind. They needed to get their hands on Marcus's technology. They wanted the weapon. They wanted the power. But Marcus wasn't about to let them take it. He didn't trust them, not anymore. The world's governments, which had once seemed like the bedrock of civilization, now felt like strangers to him. He had watched them bicker and fail when the invasion first began. He had seen their powerlessness firsthand. And so when they arrived at his doorstep, demanding access to the device, Marcus didn't back down. He didn't ask for their help. Instead, he sat on the porch of his crumbling house, a shotgun resting lazily across his lap, and waited for them to make their move. They didn't come offering thanks, or even promises of protection. They came with orders, they came with demands. But they didn't understand the kind of man Marcus was. He wasn't afraid of them. For 2 days, the arguments raged. They offered him everything: money, protection, fame. They promised him anything he wanted in exchange for the weapon. Some of them even hinted at more forceful measures, suggesting that accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. But Marcus didn't flinch. He just smiled at them, a tired, bitter smile, and told them they didn't scare him. "You think you scare me?" he said to one of the generals, his eyes steady and unwavering. "I've stared down the end of the world already. You're nothing more than ants screaming at the boot." By the 3rd day, it became clear that they weren't going to get what they wanted through persuasion or negotiation. And so, under cover of night, the military moved in. Black helicopters circled overhead, their engines growling like beasts in the dark. Armed soldiers in tactical gear swarmed through the streets, their faces hidden behind masks. They didn't come for peace. They came for control. But what they didn't know was that the town wasn't as empty as they thought. The people of Marcus's town, ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, had seen their homes burn, their families scattered, and they weren't about to let anyone take the one thing that had given them hope. As the soldiers closed in, a shot rang out. It didn't matter who fired it. All that mattered was that it was the signal, a moment of pure defiance. And then chaos erupted. What followed was a battle unlike anything the military had expected. This wasn't a fight between armies, with uniforms and structure. This was guerrilla warfare, fought in the backyards, in the alleys, in the fields where the locals knew every inch of the land. It was dirty, unrelenting, and brutal. The soldiers were trained for combat, but they weren't prepared for the fury of a town that had nothing left to lose. The government soldiers, used to dominating battles on foreign soil, were outmatched by the people they had underestimated. The civilians knew their town better than anyone. They set traps, ambushed convoys, and fought with the desperation of people who had seen the worst the world had to offer. The soldiers, expecting an easy victory, found themselves quickly overwhelmed. They retreated, leaving behind wounded comrades and a shattered sense of pride. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the people to fight back, let alone win. For the first time since the invasion, the world saw something incredible. It wasn't just Marcus Lane's weapon that had given humanity hope. It was the realization that humanity could still stand together. And that was something the invaders hadn't counted on. But the victory was short-lived. The world's governments had been humiliated, and Marcus had become a symbol of rebellion, of hope. But he wasn't interested in being a symbol, not anymore. The weapon, the fight, it wasn't enough. The war had just begun, and the aliens would return. They had to prepare. They had to make sure that next time they didn't just fight back, they fought to win. And Marcus knew that the weapon he had created was only the beginning. The world was counting on him. but he couldn't do it alone. The fight for Earth's survival was far from over. As the world began to grasp the magnitude of what had happened, the realization set in like a cold, bitter tide. The aliens weren't just going to walk away and forget about Earth. They had seen humanity's defiance. They had seen how even a single man's desperate will had managed to push them back. And now, they would be coming back, not just with more ships, but with more anger, more purpose. Marcus Lane knew this better than anyone. While the rest of the world celebrated the small victory, he prepared for the worst. It was in the weeks following the town's confrontation with the military that the magnitude of the coming war became clear. Governments, shaken by the unexpected turn of events, attempted to stabilize the global situation. But the damage was done. The invaders hadn't just torn through the cities, they had shattered the very foundation of human society. The world was no longer united by ideology, religion, or politics. It was united by survival, and even that was fragile. The alien assault had turned everything upside down, leaving nations scrambling to rebuild, all while fighting an enemy they still didn't fully understand. Back in Montana, Marcus had become more than just a survivor. He had become a reluctant leader. He hadn't asked for this role, but the people saw him as their symbol. It wasn't just his invention that had given them hope. It was the undeniable truth that a single person, when pushed to the brink, could change the course of history. Marcus had done something that many thought impossible. He had turned the tide in a war that wasn't even supposed to be winnable. But as proud as he was of that moment, Marcus knew better than anyone that the battle was far from over. He was no general, no warrior, and certainly no symbol. He was just a man who had built a weapon that might have bought humanity a moment of respite, but that wasn't enough. There was no time for celebration, no time for rest. They had to be ready for what was coming next. In a small, makeshift command center, hidden deep in the mountains, Marcus met with the most brilliant minds left in the world. The world's leaders had finally come to understand the gravity of the situation. They couldn't rely on traditional military might any longer. The aliens had shown them that the old ways of warfare, with fighter jets and missiles, were useless. What humanity needed was something different, something that could not only defend Earth but strike back with the same kind of unrelenting force that the aliens had shown. And Marcus, despite his reluctance, was the only one who seemed to know how. The room was a jumble of technology and data. Scientists from every corner of the globe huddled over monitors, analyzing Marcus's device, trying to reverse engineer its inner workings. They had little to go on. Marcus hadn't left any notes. He hadn't kept a blueprint. He hadn't recorded the process of building it. It had been a fevered creation, a spur-of-the-moment invention made out of sheer desperation. But desperation was a powerful thing, and it had driven Marcus to create something that defied all reason. The engineers and military experts surrounding him were doing their best to replicate the device, but they were struggling. None of them had the kind of experience that Marcus had. He wasn't just a technician. He was a designer, a thinker who understood how to take the broken pieces of abandoned projects and make them work. But that kind of knowledge couldn't be transferred easily. It wasn't something you could learn from a manual. And so they stumbled through the process, slowly but surely. The clock was ticking, and every day that passed brought them closer to the next alien assault. But as the weeks wore on, it became clear that the aliens weren't just sitting back and watching. They were preparing. The rift in the sky had opened again, and strange signals had started to flood Earth's communication networks. These were messages, but not the kind of messages humanity was used to. They weren't threatening. They weren't warning. They were something far worse. They were a statement of purpose. The aliens had been watching humanity carefully, analyzing their response, learning from the way Earth had fought back. and now they were ready to return. And this time, it wasn't just going to be ships. They were bringing an army, a full-scale invasion. The warning signs were everywhere. It started with small disturbances, disruptions in satellite signals, sudden bursts of strange energy that disrupted communications between the various military forces worldwide. The aliens weren't just coming. They were preparing to launch an attack that would leave nothing behind. Marcus, ever vigilant, had kept his eye on the horizon, watching for any sign of their return. He had become the de facto leader of a coalition of resistance forces, a ragtag group of soldiers, civilians, and scientists who had come together with one mission: survival. Every day, Marcus received reports of strange alien activity, ships appearing in the sky, seemingly out of nowhere, disappearing into the rift, only to return moments later. They were studying the planet, gathering intelligence. Marcus knew that their technology had surpassed anything humanity had ever dreamed of, and that they were coming to finish the job they had started. The fear began to creep in once more. Earth had been given a chance, a brief moment of hope, but it was slipping away as the days passed. The military forces of the world were no match for what the aliens were bringing. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, Marcus refused to give in to fear. He had faced death before. He had watched entire cities burn. He had stared into the eyes of an enemy that had crushed humanity without mercy, and yet he still stood. He still fought. But this time, it wasn't just his own life on the line. The survival of Earth depended on whether humanity could rise above its divisions, above its petty squabbles, and unite against a common enemy. The world governments had agreed to join forces, to pool their resources and share their knowledge. But Marcus knew it wouldn't be enough. Not unless every single person on Earth was willing to fight. The people of Earth had no idea what was coming. They were still recovering from the initial shock of the invasion. The cities were still in ruins. Families were still mourning the loss of loved ones. There was no time for healing. There was no time for rebuilding. They had to prepare for the next fight, the one that would decide the future of the human race. The alien ships were already on their way back. The countdown had begun. And as Marcus sat in his makeshift command center, watching the radar screens flicker to life with incoming alien ships, he knew that the next battle would be unlike anything humanity had ever faced. The war that had begun with the destruction of a few cities was now about to escalate into something far greater. The future of Earth rested on their shoulders, and the only way they could survive was to fight back. Harder, smarter, and with everything they had. The sense of urgency in the command center was palpable. The pressure was mounting on every person involved. Marcus, despite the weight of the responsibility, was oddly calm, as though he had accepted the magnitude of what was to come. He had spent years designing weapons for the military, creating systems that could theoretically defend against enemies, just not enemies like the ones who had arrived from beyond the stars. The feeling of isolation was creeping in, however. It wasn't just the governments he had to contend with now. It was the entire human race. They all depended on him, and that was something he hadn't been prepared for. Marcus stood in the middle of the command center, his eyes flicking over the maps, the schematics, the numbers, and the faces of those gathered around him. There was an urgency in the air that he couldn't escape, but he also saw something else. It wasn't just fear. It was determination. The resistance wasn't just surviving, they were fighting back. And it was that very spirit, the relentless refusal to be wiped out, that kept him going. The reports were coming in fast. More alien ships were entering Earth's atmosphere. The rift in the sky, which had once closed behind them, had torn open again, like a wound in the fabric of space itself. This time, it wasn't just one ship or a few scattered craft. It was an entire armada, stretching across the horizon in a vast formation that blocked out the stars. The ships weren't just enormous. They were larger, more menacing, and far more advanced. The sheer size of the fleet was enough to make anyone's heart skip a beat. Marcus knew the next few days would determine everything. If they failed to stop the aliens now, there would be no second chance. Earth had barely managed to survive the first assault. The second wave would likely wipe them out entirely. He looked at the faces around him, soldiers, scientists, engineers, farmers, each one of them determined, each one of them willing to sacrifice everything for a world that wasn't even their own. But was it enough? Was humanity truly prepared to face an enemy so far beyond their reach? The global unity that had emerged in the wake of the alien attack was fragile. As the nations began to pool their resources, old divisions and suspicions began to resurface. It was only natural, Marcus supposed. The lines between nations were still drawn. Old grudges and borders had not suddenly disappeared. Even with the common enemy, the world was still divided in many ways. But as the alien forces drew closer, those divisions seemed to melt away. No one had the luxury of thinking of themselves as anything other than human now. The invasion had forced everyone to see the truth. There was no room for self-interest. If humanity was going to survive, they would have to fight together. In the weeks before the final assault, Marcus had been meeting with leaders from every corner of the world. Military officers, scientists, engineers, political leaders, they all came to him, seeking answers. They came to him, hoping he could provide the key to their survival. But Marcus wasn't a leader. He wasn't even a politician. He wasn't a general. He was just a man, and the world was asking him to perform a miracle. The pressure was suffocating, and despite his outward calm, Marcus felt the weight of it all on his shoulders. The world was asking him to be something more than he was, a savior when he wasn't sure he even knew the way forward. The Resistance's work was still in its infancy. The reverse engineering of Marcus's weapon was progressing, but at a slow pace. The alien technology, despite their efforts, remained just out of their grasp. Every attempt to understand how the device worked, how it had even been capable of destroying one of their ships, was met with frustration. The principles were so alien, so complex, that they couldn't make any headway. The scientists were brilliant, but they were still working with the scraps of technology Marcus had left behind. No one knew how it worked. Not even Marcus. Still, they had to push forward. The clock was ticking. Every day, more ships entered the atmosphere. Every day, the threat grew closer. It was becoming harder to ignore the dark shapes looming in the sky, flickering on radar screens, blocking out the light of the sun. The aliens were preparing for something far worse than the first assault. They were going to send everything, every ship, every soldier, every weapon they had. They had learned from their first failure, and they had no intention of making the same mistake twice. For Marcus, there was no time left to waste. He couldn't afford to sit and wait for the scientists to figure out how his weapon worked. He had to act, and fast. The Resistance needed to strike first. It was the only way. It was the only way to show the invaders that humanity wasn't going to roll over. Marcus had spent too many years watching the world fall apart at the seams. Too many years watching the helplessness and indecision of world leaders. Now was the time for action. He gathered the team of engineers, military strategists, and the few remaining allies he could trust, and together they began to plan the unthinkable. Marcus was no military tactician, but he knew one thing above all else. The fight had to be taken to the aliens, and it had to be done on Earth's terms. Every defense humanity had was being fortified, improved, and readied. The Resistance forces, now unified, began to train in earnest, using Marcus's weapon as the basis for their strategy. They knew they didn't have the firepower to go toe-to-toe with the alien fleet. Not yet. But they could use the terrain, the knowledge they had of Earth, to their advantage. Guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and surprise attacks were the order of the day. Marcus had seen how the alien forces had fought in the first wave. They were powerful, yes, but they weren't invincible. They had weaknesses, and if humanity could exploit them, there was a chance, just a small one, that they might win. But there was still one major problem. The aliens had learned from their mistakes. They wouldn't underestimate humanity again. They would come prepared. The sheer scale of their invasion was almost too much to comprehend. The first assault had been like a hammer coming down on Earth's cities, smashing them into dust. But this time it would be different. The invaders had a plan. They had strategy. They had been watching, waiting, learning. And Marcus had no illusions. They weren't just preparing for a battle. They were preparing for the end of Earth's resistance. The calm before the storm was starting to feel more like an eternity than anything else. In the final days leading up to the invasion, the planet seemed to hold its breath. People still had the traces of hope from the brief victory against the first wave, but that hope was mixed with dread. The alien ships were already returning, looming like ominous shadows against the heavens. And the silence, though deafening, was unnerving. Humanity was bracing for a war they knew they could not win unless they pulled every resource, every last scrap of ingenuity they had, together. And in the quiet of underground bunkers, in secret labs, and in the hollowed-out remains of once great cities, the world's last hope was being forged. Marcus Lane sat in the same battered chair in the command center, staring at the screen in front of him. The maps and tactical grids shifted in a haze as he reviewed the plans, his eyes scanning every line, every detail. The scientists had made some progress. They had managed to replicate some of the basic principles of the device, but there were still so many unknowns. Marcus had built it out of necessity, with no regard for how it might function in the long term. And now the world's survival rested on those same shaky foundations. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was the key to Earth's future. But how could they unlock its full potential when no one even understood how it worked? Even the world's brightest minds had been reduced to mere guessing, piecing together fragments of data they could barely comprehend. "Marcus," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was General Teague, the commander of Earth's defensive forces, who had worked closely with Marcus since the initial victory. His face was drawn, tired, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't dulled despite the relentless pressure. "We've received word. The fleet is assembling." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the map. The alien armada was like a storm, a vast, unyielding force that blotted out the stars. Ships appeared on the radar, their numbers seemingly endless, stretching across the sky from horizon to horizon. The invaders had come back in force, and this time, there was no room for mistakes. "It's going to be a slaughter," Teague continued, his voice heavy with concern. "We've gathered every last bit of firepower humanity has. We've even got the electromagnetic cannons up and running, but we're still outmatched. The aliens have already begun their descent." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His mind was spinning. How could they fight back when their weapons were so ineffective? They had one weapon that could work, one that had proven itself, but even that wasn't guaranteed. He had a choice to make. Either let the world collapse under the weight of the invasion or gamble everything on the hope that his weapon, built in desperation, was enough to turn the tide. "They're not going to just sit back and watch," Marcus said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "The invaders will push us to the brink. If we wait for them to land, we've already lost. We need to strike first. We need to take out their command vessel." Teague's eyebrows furrowed. How do you propose we do that? We've barely scratched the surface of their defenses. They've got shields that absorb everything we throw at them. I don't have the answers, General, Marcus replied. But I know this. We can't sit here and let them make their move. We're not going to beat them with technology alone. We've seen that. What we have is desperation, and that's something they haven't accounted for. The room fell into a quiet hum as everyone around them absorbed Marcus's words. It was clear that the resistance was beginning to understand the gravity of what Marcus was saying. There was no room for hesitation, no more time for second-guessing. The invasion was already underway. Earth's only hope was to disrupt the alien command, to cause confusion, and to strike when the enemy was most vulnerable. Marcus had been thinking of one thing for days, one part of the plan that seemed the only way to tip the scales in their favor. They couldn't attack the invaders directly, not without a proper defense, but they could disable their ability to communicate, to coordinate. If they could take out the alien command ship, disrupt their fleet's ability to act as a unified force, they might just stand a chance. But that meant going directly into the heart of the alien invasion, into the belly of the beast, without knowing if they had the means to survive. I'll need access to the satellite grid, Marcus said, turning to the engineers. We'll need to set up a network of jammers, something to disrupt their communication long enough for us to make our move. We don't have much time. The engineers immediately got to work, tapping into the available systems and rerouting power from the remaining satellite uplinks. It was a risky move. The satellites had already been heavily damaged during the first wave of the invasion, and there was no guarantee they would hold up under the strain of this new operation. But it was all they had. We can try to scramble their communications, but it'll only buy us a few minutes at most, one of the lead engineers, Dr. Klein, said with a worried expression. The alien fleet is advanced. They'll adapt quickly. Then we don't waste time, Marcus responded. We strike hard and fast. We go straight for their flagship. The next few hours were a blur of preparation, tension, and last-minute adjustments. The resistance forces mobilized in silence, moving with the kind of precision that had only emerged in the face of absolute necessity. Soldiers, technicians, and civilians alike took their positions, their faces set with determination. There was no more fear in their eyes, not in the way there had been at the beginning of the invasion. They had come together as one, unified in purpose. The plan was simple but dangerous. Using the electromagnetic cannons and a modified version of Marcus's device, they would aim for the alien flagship, hoping to destabilize its shields long enough to allow a direct assault. At the same time, they would deploy a series of ground forces to launch attacks on the alien army, using guerrilla tactics to slow down their ground troops and buy precious time for the final strike. As Marcus and Teague stood together overlooking the battlefield from the underground command center, the ground shook beneath their feet. The first wave of alien ships had landed, their massive forms blocking out the sun. Alien soldiers began to deploy from the ships, their towering figures marching across the landscape like harbingers of doom. But humanity had prepared for this moment. "We're ready," Marcus said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet resolve that had hardened over the years of watching everything fall apart. Teague looked at him, the weight of the world in his gaze. "Let's make it count." The countdown began. The countdown was merciless, each second stretching into infinity. Marcus stood still, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, watching as the alien fleet continued to descend, blocking out the sky with their massive, foreboding shapes. The last of the resistance forces were in place, their weapons ready, their hearts steeled for what would be the most desperate fight in human history. 5 seconds, the technician's voice crackled through the speakers. "Get ready." Marcus took a deep breath, his mind sharp with focus. They had one shot at this, one chance to end the nightmare, or let it consume them all. He glanced at General Teague, whose face was set, unreadable, and then at the screen showing the alien flagship. The massive metallic craft loomed above them, pulsing with an eerie glow, a black hole of destruction that could wipe out everything they had left. The hum of the electromagnetic cannons reverberated through the command center, their massive energy capacitors primed and ready to fire. All around the world, forces were mobilizing, each one with their own task, their own role to play in this final stand. But it was all leading to this, the shot that would decide humanity's fate. 3, 2, 1, the technician called out. Marcus reached out, his hand steady, and hit the launch button. A blinding blue beam shot from the electromagnetic cannons, cutting through the air like a lightning bolt. The ground trembled with the force of it. The alien flagship's shields flickered, struggling to hold against the blast. The beam connected with the alien vessel's core, and the shields faltered. Marcus didn't allow himself to breathe. They had done it. The shield had collapsed. The flagship's hull shuddered under the impact, sparks flying from the core. A loud, grinding noise filled the air as the ship's systems struggled to hold together. It wasn't enough to destroy it, but it was enough to make it vulnerable. The alien commanders knew that something had gone terribly wrong. A moment of hesitation rippled through their ranks. "Now!" Marcus shouted. The ground forces, equipped with everything they could scrape together, plasma rifles, improvised explosives, and whatever they could carry, charged forward, taking the fight to the alien soldiers. It wasn't a clean fight. There were no perfect tactics, no neat lines of soldiers marching into battle. It was a brutal, raw assault, fueled by the kind of desperation that only comes when a species is fighting for its survival. The alien soldiers, advanced beyond human comprehension, retaliated with devastating force. Their weapons burned through the air, tearing through buildings and soldiers alike. But humanity fought back with something the invaders couldn't understand: sheer will. There was no surrender, no retreat. They had seen their cities destroyed, their families lost, and they were not going to let it happen again. Amidst the chaos, Marcus and a small team of elite soldiers pushed forward, making their way toward the flagship's vulnerable underbelly. Every step was a battle. Every inch gained came at a cost. But they had no choice. The world's survival hinged on what they did next. As they reached the outskirts of the massive alien vessel, they encountered the alien command center, guarded by towering soldiers with eyes glowing with cold alien fury. The air was thick with tension as Marcus and his team, covered in dirt and blood, took their positions. This was it, the final stand. Marcus could see the alien commander. It was enormous, a figure of pure intimidation, its skin like obsidian, glinting in the eerie light of the flagship's interior. The alien's eyes locked onto Marcus, recognition flashing across its alien features. "You are the one who dared to fight back," the commander's voice boomed, a voice that echoed with power, causing the ground beneath Marcus's feet to vibrate. "You are nothing. Your species is nothing." Marcus stood tall, his breath steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice unwavering, "and we're not going to let you destroy us." The alien commander growled, its massive form moving forward with unnatural speed, its weapon raised high. Marcus barely had time to react as the alien swung its blade, a blade that hummed with deadly energy. He dove to the side, narrowly missing the strike, his heart pounding in his chest. The alien lunged again, its weapon cutting through the air with terrifying precision. But this time, Marcus was ready. He raised his plasma rifle and fired, the blast hitting the creature's chest. It stumbled back but didn't fall. Instead, it retaliated with a roar, sending a shockwave of force that sent Marcus crashing to the ground. Pain erupted in Marcus's body, but he forced himself to rise, his legs shaking from the impact. He could hear the battle raging around him, the sound of explosions, gunfire, and alien roars filling the air. Humanity wasn't done yet. They couldn't be. Not after everything. The alien commander advanced once more, but this time Marcus was faster. With everything he had left, he tackled the creature, forcing it off balance. For a brief moment, the two were locked in a struggle, but Marcus's will was stronger. With one final push, he drove the plasma rifle into the commander's chest, releasing a shot that burned through the alien's thick armor. The alien commander staggered back, its eyes filled with shock and disbelief. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud, its massive form crumpling to the floor. A long silence followed. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. The alien fleet paused, its forces halted by the death of their leader. But that hesitation was short-lived. The remaining invaders roared in fury, their attack continuing with a renewed intensity. The battle was far from over, but the humans had struck a fatal blow. They had shown the invaders that Earth was not a world to be conquered without a fight. As Marcus stood over the fallen commander, he looked up at the alien forces, knowing that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The fight for Earth had not ended with a single victory. It was only the beginning. The invaders would not forget this defeat, but neither would humanity forget the price of their survival. And so the war raged on. It was a war for the future, for a future where humanity no longer cowered in the face of destruction, for a future where they stood, defiant and unyielding, against all odds. The invaders had underestimated them, and in the end, that would be their downfall. The story has come to an end, but the message remains clear. Humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and unwillingness to give up, even when faced with impossible odds, is the key to survival in the universe. The battle continues, but the fight for Earth has been a declaration to all who would threaten humanity. Earth will never surrender.